Hi guys, welcome back to Unorthodox Advice. Today we have special guest, one of the best and reliable source of information in terms of fitness. I'm so grateful to be able to have him here with us today. This is Dr. Pat Davidson. Pretty sure all of my Instagram followers already know who you are. I always share your Instagram posts every time you post. Very funny but very informative at the same time. I also watch several videos of yours on YouTube. I'm not sure if all of my YouTube subscribers know who you are. Some might have known you or might even a subscriber of your Power Hour already, but some might not familiar with you yet. So before we go through the 14 question I have prepared, would you mind to introduce yourself first?
I'd be happy to, and I just want to say thank you for having me on here today. And it's always a pleasure to be able to speak to people that are passionate about fitness and mechanics and just wanting to learn. So, it's really it's pretty cool, and also just getting a chance to speak to people that are in a different part of the world than where I live. I just think is one of the amazing parts about the modern world and utilizing social media and videos the way that you are. So I just want to thank you for the work you've put in and also just for thinking that this is worth people's time to have me on to answer some of these questions. But yeah, a little bit of a background on me is that, I kind of grew up with really loving athletics and playing sports, and I just took that eventually and directed it towards my own education in trying to understand the best ways to drive fitness and performance. And I ended up getting a master's degree in strength and conditioning and then a PhD in exercise physiology. I worked as a college professor for about 6 years after that, and following working as a professor, I started to work directly in the fitness industry, and I moved to New York City to be able to do that. And I've been here working directly in fitness in New York City for the last 5.5 years now. And in that process, I've also done a number of things, like I've written a couple of books that have been training-based books, Mass and Mass 2. I've also put together a recurring seminar series called Rethinking the Big Patterns that is being turned into a book, and I created an exercise database that kind of gives people a window into seeing all the exercises that fit into that model. And I like, as you mentioned, the Power Hour is a weekly recurring hour-long education session that I do here at Hype Gym in New York City, where I work out of, and that's actually what I'll be doing next, right when we get done with this.
Oh, okay.
So, but overall, I think that the primary thing that I keep in the back of my mind is that I'm still someone that really loves to use my body and train and be able to challenge myself physically. And so most of my education pursuits still revolve around that. Like, how do I maximize my own training? And by having that, like, I get a window into seeing how it might help other people, but also keeping an open mind to people that have very different physical goals than my own, and appreciating the body from the perspective of just, really trying to think of it from an anatomy and physiology standpoint at all times, and trying to understand the anatomy and the physiology to help drive the adaptations that would lead people towards the specific goals that they have in their own lives and in their own desires.
Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. Now, so we'll proceed to the first question. So the first question will be the correlation between strength and hypertrophy. I see a lot of people like to say if you always do low rep work like powerlifter, you will get strong, but not so much in terms of muscle mass. And then they name some powerlifter who can lift a very heavy weight, but they don't look muscular. And vice versa, people who are muscular but can't move heavy weight. But in my opinion, most people who are muscular are strong. Most people who are strong are muscular. But as always, there are exceptions like what I had mentioned earlier. But it's only the minority, not the majority. So I would love to hear your opinion about the correlation of strength and hypertrophy. Does strength means muscle and muscle means strength?
Yeah, I think that trying to define strength is the first objective that needs to be done. And I think that the NSCA in the U.S., the National Strength and Conditioning Association, has a very good definition of strength, which is the amount of force that a joint can produce at a given joint velocity. So, you know, you see a lot of differences in terms of like how much force a joint can produce at different velocity spectrums. But assuming that we're talking about low velocity force production, which is generally kind of where people get to with talking about strength, then you get into what does the research say is the best predictor of how strong someone is. And the cross-sectional area of the muscle tissue that's the prime mover of a specific joint action is the number one predictor. So the greatest correlation in terms of, you know, what would be associated with force production is the cross-sectional area of the muscle mass. So then you get into these secondary questions regarding like, hey, I saw this guy who looked really skinny, but he just deadlifted like 300 kilos. Like, how does that work? And I think that when you start talking about that, you look at certain leverages that people might have relative to a barbell for a specific lift.
Yeah.
And the deadlift is a good example of that, because when you encounter people that have exceptionally long arms, for instance, they don't need to get into the same degree of hip flexion and knee flexion and ankle dorsiflexion to be able to reach the barbell as someone that doesn't have the same anthropometrics. So it would be a more true test if you put people into the exact same joint angles and tried to measure how much force they're capable of producing at those very specific joint angles. Because that's what doesn't happen. We have these sort of arbitrary lifts that occur, like, hey, the way that this exercise works is the bar starts on the ground and you pick it up until you're standing straight up and down. But it doesn't necessarily even out the joint angles. So, you know, if you had someone with very poor joint leverages for a deadlift and you simply elevated the bar off the ground until you put them into the same joint angles as someone that's probably better built for the deadlift, you would get a much truer demonstration of actually what that force production really is all about.
Okay, I get it. Okay, so we move to the second question. Thanks very much for the detailed explanation. Now,
I would say just to because it's a somewhat, like, I think every answer has multiple facets to it.
Yeah.
And like that's just one example. I do think simultaneously to that though, that when you talk about powerlifting style training versus bodybuilding training, one of them is a more neurological adaptation driven one versus a more of a tissue driven style of training. It's just that, like, I think that I'm always trying to compare apples to apples.
Okay.
And I don't think that we oftentimes do that when we don't control for joint angles, which is just not part of the sport of powerlifting. And the sport of powerlifting is essentially, how do I manipulate my body so that I put myself into the most advantageous joint angles and do the least amount of mechanical work I possibly can to move the greatest amount of load I possibly can.
Okay, I understand it. Okay.